Let's take things a touch further before we look at anything different. I've mentioned some of these terms already. Let's make sure we're really happy with them. We've got different types of contractions. Can I just sort of summarize first of all? Isotonic simply means changing length. Okay, and we'll come back to examples of this in a second. So isotonic simply means changing length. Whereas isometric, literally, if we translate it, equal length, this means no change in length. That's all we're talking about with those terms. So get those terms nice and clear. So any moment of stillness where a pair of muscles both remain at equal length, by the way, both contracting with equal, I'm going to say force, but it's really a torque. They're contracting against one another to hold you still, as I mentioned before. Examples here would be things like a ready position. You know, think about a table tennis player waiting to receive a serve. Things like this would be the initial shove in a rugby scrum. And I really like that terminology, the initial shove in a rugby scrum. We are contracting and pushing, but there is actually no changing length in the muscle. Whereas our two isotonic contractions, we've got changing length. Now let's start with the basic one. We've got concentric here. The muscle shortens under tension. Now this is the one we tend to think about as the, quotes, normal type of contraction. But what's happening here is that a muscle, as it contracts, let me just draw a sort of a very primitive muscle here. A muscle, as it contracts, two tendons on the end going off to combine with a skeleton. Now, this is a terrible drawing, but you get the idea. Look, here's a bone here. Here's a bone here. I mean, that's roughly what a muscle will do. And what's happening here is a concentric contraction is when this muscle is getting shorter under tension. We'll come back to examples of this in a second, okay? Now, an eccentric contraction, still under tension, notice, but now what we're getting is the muscle would be lengthening. So this would be as if this muscle was in fact lengthening but working simultaneously. And you might want to start to be thinking about, well, why would that happen? And actually, there's a little clue to understanding this. Muscles can only pull. Okay, so muscles can only pull. So if we want these two bones to kind of move away from one another, this muscle can't push them. So all it can do is kind of hold and resist that movement, which is already happening. And that really defines an eccentric contraction. Now, with that in mind, let's look at one very simple example. We're going to come back to this in a second. It's the idea of a press up. Now, we've already sort of looked at the upward phase earlier on when I looked at that previous example. And of course, when we're on the upward phase, the tricep works concentrically. In other words, on the way up, this muscle here, with its origin up the top and its insertion down here on the ulna, by the way, what this does is the muscle shortens under tension. Now, I want you to imagine that's concentric, of course. Let me put conc. That's concentric. Now, let's imagine that tension disappears all of a sudden. This person on the way down, unless it was controlled, right, they'd literally smash their nose on the floor, right? That's what's going to happen. Don't try it. Well, I mean, you can picture it very, very easily. So what happens is this muscle, even though we're now getting elbow flexion, this muscle is not simply relaxing. It is lengthening, but it's tense. In other words, it's controlling. I like to say it's acting as a brake, you know, the sort of brakes that you have on the middle pedal of a manual car. A brake, it's slowing down the descent. It's under tension, it's lengthening. Now, can I be clear here? Normally, when we get elbow flexion, it's the bicep that's working, right? Think about your bicep curl, elbow flexion, right? In this case, this bicep muscle here is the antagonist on the downward face. It is relaxing. And that, folks, is why we've got an eccentric contraction in that particular case. So I really want to stress those points. Now, obviously we're in revision mode here, so we're going to go nice and quick. If you're with your teacher, you can discuss this. We're going to do loads of examples in a few moments time. But before we finish it off and go and have a look at a question, I want to stress a super important point. Now, we've provided note spaces for you in your notes, right? So this is where it becomes important. Let's just look at the components of the musculoskeletal system. Muscles, you guys learn them as contractile proteins in biology, specialist. I've done those lessons too. I teach that stuff too. But muscles, they are there to contract. I've said already, all they can do is pull, okay? Whether it's concentric or eccentric or isometric. Now, the skeleton, okay, is a rigid structure, okay? And it's there to be moved. So we need a combination tissue. We need something that puts these things together. So we've got the muscles, these contractile proteins ram full of mitochondria. We've got they specialized fibers. We've got the skeleton. It's solid, although hollow. It needs to be moved, and muscle do that. So what do we have in between them? We have tendon tissue, and tendon is there for force transmission. So guys, look at this, please. What have we got? We've got the muscle that contracts. Let's say it's the concentric contraction on the way up. That wants to pull against the rigid structure of the bone, for whatever, let's say the long bones in the arm, for argument's sake, and it's the tendon that transmits that force. So the muscle contracts, phase 1, the tendon transmits that force, phase 3, the skeleton is then moved, phase 2, and then skeleton is then moved, phase 3. Now, that's a very, very simplistic way of looking at this, but let's be crystal clear. This tricep here, this little line here, this is a tendon. That's meant to be pointing just below the muscle. We've got a tricep tendon, which is connecting it, in this case, to the ulna, to the point of the ulna. In fact, think about your first-class lever systems if you want a bit more detail on that. So we must ensure we understand this. Now, with that in mind, let's have a look at a question. Our question was, and I should say at this point, you should have your practice questions in front of you ideally. Now, if you haven't, then do try and find them. If you're watching this on demand, get into the description or onto the hub page, print them off. If you're live, start scrabbling around quickly, see if you can get hold of them, because these images are in your practice questions. They're also, obviously, the mark schemes are in the mark scheme, but also you've got the model answers, which I've got in the picture here. Explain how skeletal and muscular systems work together to cause movement. They work in pairs. There's my first mark, antagonistic pairs. This is achieved by a muscle pulling on a bone via a tendon. Notice my force transmission. This allows the movement to occur, and then bones act as levers. So levers is a really nice phrase for us to get into our answers. And what do I pick up for that? I pick up 3 marks. Now, can I stress to you, that is a model answer for that question. Given that this question is named in your, this topic is named in your AEI, I cannot stress importantly enough that you should at the very least be able to reproduce those 4 points. I would even argue that if you can't go and reproduce that, whatever it is, 3-line answers, almost to the word, literally to the word, if that question comes up, then, you've got to have a bit of a word with yourself. Okay, we're going to